Do you have a favorite sermon? I do. Actually, I have several favorite sermons. E.K. Bailey's My Name is Hosea moves me every time I hear it, and his Testimony of a Tax Collector, the story of Zacchaeus. And then there's Fred Craddock's When the Roll is Called Down Here, still amazes me. Kyle Idleman's Not a Fan series turned my life right side up in a very good way. Then there's Don Sanukian's A Night in Persia, or The Shortest Distance Between 2 Points is a Zigzag. And the list could go on and on and on. Think about your favorite sermons. What made those sermons so great? You could probably come up with a list of several characteristics that made those sermons so effective, made them so good, made them so great. But I'm convinced that there are 4 pillars of great preaching. So if you find your preaching growing a little bit stagnant, if you're looking for a simple way to improve, I would encourage you to invest a little bit of time pouring into one of these 4 pillars. What are these 4 pillars of great preaching? Here's the first pillar of great preaching. Great preaching is engaging. It's interesting for the listeners. It's been said by preachers that it is a sin to bore people with the Word of God. Now, clearly that's hyperbole. It's a bit of exaggeration. But the point is, the Word of God that we preach, it is alive. It's active. And how could we preach a living, active, vibrant Word with a deadness? How could we bore our listeners? So this might lead to some creativity. So feel free to try creative expressions, like using props, like telling stories, asking thought-provoking questions. Consider creating dialogue between the author and the biblical audience, as they would first have encountered that text. Consider telling a portion of the sermon from the perspective of one of the characters in the story. Be creative. Do whatever it takes to interest and engage your listeners so that they can see that this biblical text, it's interesting. In a recent sermon I preached in chapel on Genesis 22, where God tests Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, I began the sermon from the perspective of Abraham, as he kind of reflected back on his test, wondering if he did the right thing. And it was simply an attempt to show them that this text, it's engaging, it's interesting. So the first pillar of great preaching should be interesting. It should be engaging. Here's the second pillar of great preaching. Great preaching should be relevant. Our listeners ought to be able to see how this biblical text, written so many centuries ago, still applies to their lives today. And they ought to be able to see it connect with them in a very real way. And that means that we need to create some real-life hypothetical scenarios. When we give them the truth of the biblical text, and they start asking a question like, yeah, but what does that look like in real life? Then we need to come prepared with some believable, realistic, hypothetical scenarios that can make them think, oh, that's what it looks like in real life. For example, I was recently preaching from Colossians 4, verses 2 through 6. And one of my main movements in the sermon was that our actions should preach. Paul says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders, making the most of every opportunity. And so I was encouraging our listeners to make sure that our actions preach to non-believers, because our actions can speak very loudly. And I assume they're asking the question, yeah, but what does that look like in real life? So I gave them this hypothetical scenario. Let's say after church, your family is going out to lunch. You've got a meeting in the afternoon, somewhere you've got to be, and so you simply decide to go get some fast food. You place your order at the counter, and your family grabs a table. And after about 5 minutes of sitting at the table, you begin to look around, and there are families at the nearby tables, and they're growing agitated, frustrated. They've been there longer than you, and they still don't have their food. 10 minutes pass, 15 minutes, then 20. Finally, your order is ready. You go up to the counter, grab the food, and bring it back to the table, only to discover that several of the items are wrong. You grab your receipt, you grab those items, and you make your way to the counter, and you want to give the worker a piece of your mind. Tell him how frustrated you are with their poor service. But Paul says, be wise, make the most of your opportunities, because you never know when a non-believer might be watching your example. It's a simple, hypothetical, realistic illustration that helps your listeners say, oh, that's what that truth looks like in real life. Great preaching has to be relevant to our listeners' lives, right here, right now. The third pillar of great preaching is that great preaching must be clear. I think this is the most frequently overlooked pillar of preaching. We want to make sure that when our listeners hear our message and they walk out of our sanctuaries, our auditoriums, they have no question what that sermon was about. And so this involves us using a lot of consistent key language. You're going to want to identify a couple key phrases, maybe a few key words that you're going to introduce during the introduction, and you're going to weave that all the way through your message. So in that message that I spoke on Colossians 4, I used the phrase, live out your mission. And I used the word purpose. Even when I didn't use the phrase live out your mission, I still used the word mission. I introduced those concepts at the very beginning of the sermon in an introductory illustration about a life-saving rescue station that forgot its mission of life-saving. And in a similar way, if the church isn't careful, we can forget our mission to be a life-saving station. We can forget our purpose to exist. And I took those phrases, I took those words, and we just kind of wove them throughout the message. It's one way to ensure a little bit more clarity for your listeners. Another way to ensure a little bit more clarity is by giving a little bit of a summary of your text before you actually read that portion of the text. So if you're going to be reading 2 or 3 verses, give your listeners 2 or 3 sentences that summarizes what you're going to be reading. It's kind of a clue as what they should be looking for or listening for as you're reading. How many times have you listened to a preacher read a text and halfway through their reading you kind of checked out? And then you checked back in only to realize you have no idea what the preacher was reading. Well, when a preacher gives you a clue ahead of time, it helps us track a little bit more closely with what we're reading in the biblical text. It's one way to help you be a little bit clearer in your preaching. We want to make sure that our preaching is clear. And another way that we do that is by restating critical or key sentences, like your dominant thought, your big idea. You want to state it, and then you want to state it slightly differently. So in case somebody didn't quite grasp it the way you said it the first time, they'll get it when you restate it. The same goes for your main headings. You want to state them, and then you want to state them again, and put it in slightly different terms, so that in case they don't catch it the first time, they'll get it the second time or the third time. You want to restate those key sentences, even rhetorical questions. Restate those key questions as well. That's the third pillar of great preaching. Great preaching has to be clear. And here's the fourth and final pillar of great preaching. It's probably the one you've been expecting. Great preaching is biblical. Great preaching, in every way, shape, and form, must be true to the biblical text. So our dominant thought, our big idea, it's got to line up with the big idea of the text. Our structure should in some way capture the structure of the biblical text. And where many preachers get it wrong is in what Haddon Robinson called the heresy of application, where preachers do an excellent job exegeting the text, explaining what it meant, but when it came time to apply it, they began wandering in the parking lot, picking clovers in right field. making some application that listeners are left scratching their heads wondering, how does that tie into the biblical text? So we want to make sure that every component of our sermon is biblical, that it is true to the message of the biblical text. If you find yourself struggling in your preaching, if you've grown complacent, a little stagnant, may I suggest that you take some time and you invest in one of these 4 pillars of great preaching. Great preaching is interesting, it's relevant, it's clear, and it's biblical.